Looking down at her boss's desk, Purity was indeed satisfied with her work. Once again, she had managed to outdo herself and complete a given task in a short amount of time. She smiled at herself as she walked away from her boss's desk, knowing that she had placed a very important contract on his desk, even though he was 2 hours late for work. Just as she was about to exit the office door swung open. Purity sprung backward in shock, her eyes shut with quick effect, her heart beating 1,000 times, not knowing what had caused the door to snap open like that. "You can open your eyes. I won't bite." Purity heard the hoarse voice. Her eyes shot open, her heart calming as she realized it was her boss's voice. Scott stood at the door, leaning onto the frame with every piece of strength he had left. "Mr. Webb, it's you. You scared me," Purity told her boss with a smile on her face. Scott, even in his somewhat sobering state, could still make out the woman in front of him, because Purity was unlike any woman he had ever met. Her style of dressing was one even an old woman would not want for herself, but she was great at her job, hence why she had managed to work for him for the last 4 years. Scott smiled to himself, inwardly thinking how such a bland woman like Purity could manage to be so happy with so little and no outward beauty. "How do you do it?" Scott asked her, wanting desperately to know how Purity had managed to be happier than he was, even without the millionaire status that he had. It seemed as though his question had caught Purity off guard, as she stuttered without really saying much. She seemed almost unsure of herself, unlike the women Scott was familiar with. Staring at Purity as she struggled to get her words out only infuriated him, and the more he rubbed his temples out of sheer frustration that a smart woman like Purity could also be clueless. Scott walked past her towards his desk and threw himself onto his leather office chair. Purity was unfazed by her boss's behavior. In the last 4 years, she had seen her fair share of her boss's numerous affairs, messy breakups, intoxicated behavior, and she had grown used to it. "There's a glass of water on your desk and painkillers to get rid of the headache," Purity informed Scott, whose eyes shot open. And surely, there it was, the glass of water and the painkillers. He smiled at her, pointing his index finger at Purity and shaking it. "How is it that you always know what I need?" Scott asked Purity. Clearly, she was shy as she looked away from him. "Well, I saw a tabloid this morning of, well, you at the club, so I put 2 and 2 together." Purity did not have to explain any further. Scott knew just what she was trying to say, all without trying to upset him. His escapades around the city of London were nothing new to everyone who knew him, and often the tabloids took advantage of that. "You should stop reading those tabloids and take time for yourself," Scott informed Purity. Still looking away from Scott, she played with her fingers, anything than to look her boss in the eyes. "I do take time for myself, sir," Purity informed her boss, but Scott was not buying it. For the past 4 years that Purity had worked for him, she had shown no sign of having a life of her own. Rather, she had been absorbed in being the best employee she could be. Throwing his hands in the air, Scott had given up once more. There was no way that he could help her, as she was unwilling to change. "Okay, suit yourself. In the meantime, can I please get the collection contract?" "Right in front of you, sir." Purity looked back in her boss's direction and pointed at the document in front of him. On his desk was the contract, with his favorite pen right beside it. Looking up from his desk, Scott smiled at Purity. "What would I do without you?" he asked, opening the file, picking up his pen and signing the document. "I'm sure you can do a lot without me, sir," Purity answered, not giving herself credit for anything she ever did. Signing the contract, Scott handed it to Purity, which she received. "Please tell Amelia to reschedule my meetings." "No need to worry, sir. I already told her," Purity responded, seemingly unbothered that she thought ahead of her boss. How did you know that I was going to reschedule my meetings? Well, you were out late last night, and I figured that you would be tired and you would not be in the best position to make any decisions, Purity informed him. And Scott sat on his chair, stunned that there was a woman who understood him more than he understood himself. Well, thank you. Scott thanked Purity once more for going out of her way. No need to thank me, sir. I am simply doing my job, Purity responded and turned on her heel, only to stop and turn back and face her boss. Also, Bianca called, Purity informed her boss. Scott raised his eyebrow, knowing that there was trouble brewing nearby. What did she say? She saw pictures of you at the club, entertaining another woman. I must say she sounded very upset. Should I send her flowers, a diamond necklace, and a sorry card? Purity asked him. Scott smiled, knowing that she had done this more times than he could count. Yes, Purity, send her that. Maybe she'll stay out of my way for a few days, Scott commented. This caused her to smile at her boss. Sure, sir, I can do that. She smiled, turned on her heel once more, and exited his office. Walking into her own office, Purity felt exhausted. Dealing with Scott's drama was a 24-hour job, and she had to be informed at all times. There was a knock on her door, causing Purity to turn and face it, and there Amelia was. Hello, Miss Fixer-Upper, Amelia joked, and Purity smiled at someone who was her closest friend in the office. I am not a fixer, Purity corrected her friend. Amelia walked into Purity's office and stopped right in front of her. Yes, you are. You practically organize his life for him because he can't get anything together, Amelia commented. Purity's hand quickly came over Amelia's mouth. Don't say that about him. He might hear you, Purity warned her friend, who quickly removed Purity's hand from her mouth. Oh, he won't. Plus, his office is across yours, and those doors are thick to keep all the sounds in from all the women he's been doing in there, Amelia spat out, her words causing Purity's eyes to widen in shock. You have no proof of that, Purity exclaimed, her reply causing Amelia to roll her eyes at her. And you're telling me that you've never caught Mr. Webb making out with a female in his office? Amelia's question had come as a shock to Purity, catching her off guard. I am afraid I cannot answer that, Purity responded. And by saying that, you have just answered my question. Yes, you have caught our boss with multiple women in his office making out. That's not true. I simply chose not to answer your question, Purity defended herself. Why? Amelia, it is ridiculous. We cannot be talking about our employer like that. If he finds out, we could lose our jobs. Purity stated the obvious, and this only made Amelia smile. Well, I would certainly get fired, but not you, Amelia pointed out. No, we would both get fired, Purity corrected her friend. She stopped as she saw that Amelia was staring at her. What? Purity asked her best friend. You are so oblivious to everything happening around you. If there was one person whose job was secured, that person would be you. You're not serious. Yes, I am, Purity. Mr. Webb can't function without you. It's so obvious to everyone except you. But I guess it's normal. You're always so selfless that you don't realize just how important you are to this company, Amelia stated, and her words caught Purity off guard, causing her to stop what she was busy with and stare at her friend. Surely you don't mean that. Mr. Webb is smart, with multiple fashion qualifications and experiences under his belt, as well as— Before Purity could continue further, Amelia interrupted her. You see what I mean? You can't even say anything bad about another human being if you tried. Amelia smiled at her friend, who stared at her with a confused expression on her face. What? Is there something on my face? Purity questioned Amelia, and then quickly ran her hands all over her face to make sure there was nothing there. Nothing. Just something that crossed my mind, that's all," Amelia responded to her, but her sly smile was enough to make Purity wonder what it was that her friend was thinking. "Are you sure?" Purity questioned Amelia, who flashed an innocent smile at Purity. The girl had wicked thoughts, and it bothered Purity that she could not get her head wrapped around it. Without warning, Amelia walked towards the exit of Purity's door. As she was about to leave, Purity stopped her. "Yes?" Amelia replied. "Where are you going? I thought you could help me with a few things," Purity asked her friend. "I wish I could help, but your boss, Mr. Webb, wants us all to work as slaves," Amelia muttered, not exactly thrilled about the idea of having to work rather than being on her phone. "Oh, come on, he's not that bad," Purity defended her boss once again. "I should have known that you would come to his defense," Amelia uttered, rolling her eyes in the process. Purity walked over to her desk, her back facing Amelia, all to hide her embarrassment, as she realized that she defended her boss more than usual. Purity chose to keep herself busy by arranging her files and stacking them in an orderly manner, whilst Amelia spoke in the background. "So?" Amelia asked Purity. She turned around just in time to hear her friend. "What were you asking me?" Purity asked her friend, feeling pretty embarrassed that she had not listened to her friend speak the entire time. "The girls and I were thinking of going out tonight, and I thought that maybe I should—" "Thank you for the offer, but I'm afraid I have to turn it down," Purity replied, returning to her filing. She had lost count of the number of times she was offered the chance of spending time with her other colleagues, but, as always, she had declined. "You should not overwork yourself like this," she heard Amelia say. And deep down, Purity knew that her friend was indeed right. But then again, working hard was all she knew. It created the kind of stability that she needed. "I understand what you're saying, but maybe one day I might take you guys up on that offer," Purity replied, making sure to keep her back facing her friend at all times. "Sure, and I will be here waiting for you to agree, one of these days," Amelia informed Purity, and then exited the office. Silence filled the office, and it was then that Purity felt the loneliness hit her at her weakest spot. Deep down, she knew that offering Amelia to help her finish filing was far from the truth. In reality, what she needed was the company. Not the company of a crowd, in a bar, getting drunk, but she needed a friend like Amelia to speak to. Although Purity kept her life private from the world, she didn't mind occasionally allowing Amelia into it. Chapter 2. The Deed. Prologue. Purity was well aware that she only had an hour left to get her boss's formal suit at the company's warehouse. One of the many perks Mr. Webb had was that on various occasions the company would design him a one-of-a-kind suit that he would wear at his events. Today was no different, with the exception that Mr. Webb had neglected to inform her that he needed the suit picked up today. But luckily for him, Purity remembered, with a big, bright smile on her face, feeling pleased with herself that once again she was at the top of her game. Purity walked into the warehouse. "Purity! Purity!" She spun to see who it was that had called her, and luckily enough she saw who it was. Madeline walked towards her, panic written over her face so much that it was enough to put Purity on edge. "What is it? Did something happen?" Purity frantically asked Madeline, hoping that nothing bad had happened. The last thing she wanted was to disappoint her boss. "Yes, something happened. No one called me to inform me that the suit needed to be finished today of all days." As soon as those words left Madeline's mouth, Purity's heart sank into her stomach. That was it. She had let her boss down, and he would never again trust her. The worst scenario in her book. Purity stared into the far distance, thinking of possible ways to fix the matter at hand. Even though working at Fashion for Women for 4 years, she knew absolutely nothing about stitching, tailoring, anything. For the first time since working with Mr. Scott Webb, she had failed him, and she might never live this down. "Purity!" She turned her head, looking right into Madeline's eyes, and the older woman seemed concerned. "Yes?" Purity answered, half her attention with Madeline and the other trying to figure out how she might solve the situation at hand. "You look like you've seen a vision of the end of the world or something," Madeline joked. But it was not funny to Purity, because after this, she might have just seen the end of her working career with Fashion for Women. "That's it, Purity. Everything you have worked for the last 4 years is gone down the drain," Purity mentally reminded herself. She had worked her entire life to be independent, escape the label of orphan, and she was about to be labeled as unemployed. "We can make it work, though," Madeline responded. Purity's eyes shot wide open, not believing what she had just heard, because the last thing she wanted was to give herself false hope. "What?" Purity asked her friend. Madeline smiled at her, grabbed her hand in hers, and walked her to the elevator. Purity refused to utter a single word as they entered the elevator and the doors shut. Her body was still in shock, right up until the elevator doors swung open and she walked into the designer's room. Stopping at the entrance of the design room, Purity's heart stopped. She dropped her notebook and covered her mouth with her hands. Right in front of her, a few meters away, was a mannequin, clothed in Mr. Webb's midnight suit. Purity let out a breath of relief, one that she did not know that she was holding in until she set her eyes on the newly designed suit. She turned her head to Madeline, who was grinning at her. Only then did Purity realize that her colleague had tricked her into thinking that the suit was incomplete. "Why? When?" Still in a state of shock, Purity questioned her colleague, who was still smiling at her. "Well, 2 weeks ago that was all you talked about. I then took it upon myself to set a reminder, and without waiting for confirmation, I simply did it," Madeline confessed. And Purity was thrilled about it. Her heart settled knowing that her job was saved. Nudging Madeline lightly, both women laughed about the incident that had taken place. And worse, the look on Purity's face as she was told that the suit was incomplete. In a split second, Purity had rushed towards the mannequin and touched the suit, ran her fingers all over its fine fabric, inspecting every button and ensuring every stitch was in place. Looking back at her colleague, she smiled. "It is perfect! You have just saved my job, Madeline, and I did not know where I would have been if you had not finished the suit on time." Purity thanked her friend, but it was Madeline's raised eyebrow that caught her off guard. "You're kidding me, right?" Madeline asked Purity sarcastically as she picked up her cup of coffee and handed a cup of tea to Purity. Looking at Madeline, bewildered by her friend's question, she also raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're asking. By the way, thank you for the tea." She thanked Madeline as she took a sip of her tea, but Madeline still had her eyes on Purity. "Are you blind? Mr. Webb firing you? As common as lightning striking the same place twice," Madeline said in a sardonic tone. "That statement is false. Lightning can indeed strike the same place twice," Purity corrected Madeline, in which she smiled and rolled her eyes. Purity sipped her tea, but she could not help but wonder what Madeline had meant, and it bothered her. Even as she watched Madeline carefully as she placed the suit on a hanger and in a garment bag, she could not get the idea out of her head. "What did you mean by what you said earlier?" Purity asked her colleague, who zipped up the bag and then looked at Purity with a smile on her face. "You're too innocent to see that Mr. Webb cannot fire you, even if the bastard—" "Hey, don't say that about him!" Purity jumped to her boss's defense. "You see what I mean? You are so innocent that you try to defend him, even in his absence. Look, basically what I am trying to say is that Mr. Webb needs you. I mean, look at the guy. He leeches off of you," Madeline stated. She looked irritated. and Purity could not understand why. No, he does not need me. Amelia said the same thing, and I think that you both have lost your minds. Purity cracked a joke, hoping that it would lighten the mood between them. But the saddened look on Madeline's face indicated that she had not found the joke funny at all. You need to stop going above and beyond for people like Mr. Webb, because he doesn't even care for himself. The guy is probably either stoned or hungover right now. You don't know that. But I do know that he was out in London's most exclusive clubs last night, drinking as if it were his last day on Earth, Madeline stated, and even Purity could not argue with that. She was aware that her boss was out till the early hours of the morning. Here you go. Madeline handed Purity the garment bag containing the suit. Purity took the bag and smiled at her friend, looking into her eyes as she took the garment bag. He's not a bad man, Purity defended her boss, and the look of sadness washed over Madeline's face. I know he's not. It's you that I'm worried about. Without saying another word, Madeline exited her office and left Purity at the center of the design room by herself. Bianca, for the last time, can we get this over with already? Scott tried explaining to his now ex-girlfriend that he was through with her, but it seemed as though a breakup was not a part of Bianca's plan for them. You can't just break up with me. People are going to laugh at me. Bianca raised her voice. If there was something that Scott would not miss about Bianca, it was her shrieking voice and vanity. The media will find another interesting story to write about, trust me, Scott stated, walking back to his desk as he tried to distance himself from Bianca. No, they will not. They are going to hound me at every turn and ask me about you, Scott. Look, we can make it work, because you mean everything to me and nothing can ever change that, Bianca stated her claim. He placed both his hands inside his designer pants and focused his attention solely on Bianca as he studied her. I mean everything to you. Yes, you do, and I can't leave you for anything in the world, Bianca pleaded. Scott smiled. He was not used to seeing this side of Bianca. The Bianca he knew would never beg. Rather, she was proud and arrogant. How does 15,000 pounds sound? Scott asked Bianca, his voice apathetic as he looked at her. Make it 25,000 pounds. One of those expensive diamond necklaces, and we're set, Bianca replied, smiling as she was pleased with herself. Crossing his hands over his chest, Scott smiled at himself. He was familiar with women like Bianca. It came with the territory for him. I'll have my PA send you the check, as well as your diamond necklace, Scott promised her. With one last smile, Bianca turned on her heel and walked towards the exit. Just as she unlocked the door, standing right in front of her, was Purity, with her hands raised, about to knock on the door. Good morning, Miss Bianca. I was not aware that you would be here today, Purity responded, always with a cheerful smile on her face. Hi, Purity. Bianca greeted her with a smug look on her face, one that made Purity feel out of place. Bianca leaned closer to Purity's ear. After he's done with you, he'll dump you, just like he does with the rest of us, she whispered into her ear. Her words sent a chill down Purity's spine, and even as she watched Bianca walk past her, the cold feeling was still there. Are you going to stand there the entire day? Purity looked ahead of her. Mr. Scott stood, leaning on his desk, his hands across his chest and smiling at her. Deciding to push Bianca's words away, Purity smiled as she entered her boss's office. Good day, Mr. Webb. And how are you doing this lovely day? Let's just say I have 25,000 pounds less in my bank account, Scott confessed, and the look of recognition appeared on Purity's face. I'll prepare the check for her as soon as I'm done. But you have a function tonight, Purity reminded him, and Scott's eyes grew wider. I forgot about that, Scott exclaimed, slamming his hands on his desk. He could not believe that he had missed such an important event, one that was dear to his father's heart. "I knew you would forget." "Yeah, sure. I need to get myself something to wear. Hold all my calls for me while I run to the warehouse and get something. Anything." "No need to," Purity interrupted her boss. "Why not?" Scott asked Purity, who continued smiling at him, although he was going through a meltdown. Purity handed the garment bag over to her boss. "Here you go. I had Madeline design and make a suit for you." The thrilled look on Scott's face was one that Purity would never forget as she watched her boss receive the garment bag. "Thank you, Purity. What would I do without you?" "I am pretty sure that there is a lot that you can do without me," Purity responded as Scott unzipped the garment bag to reveal his midnight-colored suit. "I need one last thing from you, though, if you will be kind enough to carry out the task," Scott asked Purity. Her heart leaped. "Sure, sir. If it's within my power, then I will." Like a faithful employee, she waited. "Well, since Bianca and I are no longer together, would you mind accompanying me to the fashion fundraising event?" Chapter 3. Event. Prologue. "Here you are. There's no turning back now," Purity uttered to herself, and even as she looked at herself in the mirror, she hated looking at her round figure. She specifically remembered trying to wiggle her way out of coming to the fundraising function, but in the end, she agreed. Letting her boss down was something that she did not want to do. She chose to fix her red, knee-length dress down. It hardly fit her. Rather, it suffocated her body in every corner of it. Having Mr. Webb hand her his card had felt like a dream come true. He trusted her, but unluckily for her, having a limitless card meant nothing when all of the stores only had size zeros to begin with. Purity turned her attention to the bed where her phone rang. She quickly ran towards it and answered the phone without looking at the caller ID. She knew that it was none other than Mr. Webb. "Hello, Mr. Webb," Purity answered, almost out of breath, and excited that her boss was on his way to her little apartment to fetch her. He was on his way to her house, no doubt about that. She could hear the roaring of his Rolls-Royce Phantom 7. "Hey, Purity, I am so sorry to disappoint you, but I will not be coming to get you tonight," Scott informed Purity, his tone of voice filled with no emotion, as always. Disappointment filled Purity. Her heart felt as though it had been ripped from her chest, but she had to be strong. "Sure, it's okay, sir, and I understand." Purity chose to lie, because deep down she was disappointed. "Sure, my driver is on his way." "But sir, hello?" There was no use in trying. Her boss had already ended the call, and not long after, there was a honking of a car, and she knew that the driver had arrived. The drive to the hotel was not that long, but to Purity, it seemed as though it was forever. And the thought of Mr. Webb not fetching her etched deep into her memory. She felt a tight grip in her heart. "No need to be upset about this. He is just your boss, and you are just an employee," Purity reminded herself mentally. She had accustomed herself to doing such for as long as she could remember. Besides, she liked the idea of being hidden from the crowd. "We're here," Mr. Webb's driver announced. Of course, Purity did not need to be told that they had arrived when she was part of the planning for the charity function. "Thank you," Purity responded, and stepped out of the car. Upon stepping out of the car, Purity quickly regretted her decision, as the cold wind blew, and she had no coat to keep her warm. She quickly ran towards the steps and walked through the hotel doors, and again, she was reminded of the contrast between her world and that of her boss. The chandelier above her glistened as the light from its bulbs shone on it, and Purity could not remember when last that she had seen something so beautiful. "You are late," Mr. Webb's voice came through, forcing Purity to look away from the chandelier and return to the real world, where nothing was ever magical. She tried to smile at her boss, But with one hand in his pocket, no smile on his face, she knew that her boss was irritated. "Good evening, sir. My apologies for being this late. It's just that," Purity told her boss from across the room, only for Mr. Webb to interrupt her with his no-nonsense tone. "No need to explain. My driver told me that the car caught a little bit of a problem," he explained himself, his attention elsewhere, probably scouring for his next mistress. "Thank you, sir." "You are welcome. Follow me to the ballroom," Mr. Webb informed her, and walked away without waiting for Purity. She followed behind her boss, or rather ran after him as his long legs covered more space than hers did. The doors swung open, revealing a packed ballroom filled with all sorts of people. Everyone looked rich. She was used to seeing people of a different class, those that are more distinguished than her. But when she looked up, Mr. Webb was gone, and she was all alone. Her insecurities flared up once more, seeing countless women in their expensive and fine-fitted dresses. "Thank you so much for helping me. You have no idea how much this means to me." One of the servers, whose name was Darcy, thanked Purity, who had helped her clean up and load the dishes. "It's no big deal. I needed to be away from the crowd anyway," Purity confessed. She had spent her entire night overlooked by everyone, and worst of all, Mr. Webb was nowhere to be found. She had watched proudly as Mr. Webb had given his heartwarming speech, the very same speech that Purity had helped him write, and after he had gotten off the stage, he had disappeared. "He's probably found another one of his mistresses to warm his bed," Purity kept thinking to herself. The thought of her boss being in bed with yet another woman was one that she dared not think about. "That's it! We're all done!" Darcy clapped her hands together, excited that her work was done, with the help of Purity. "Yes, we are. I have to go now, and it was a pleasure helping you." Both women said goodbyes to one another. Purity left the kitchen and was on her way out of the hotel to catch a taxi, but she stopped as her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she looked at the caller ID. "Yes, Mr. Webb?" Purity answered her phone with lightning speed. Gripping onto her phone, Purity's heart stopped as she heard her boss's distressed voice coming through the phone. His words were slurred as he pleaded for help. "What is your room number?" Purity asked Mr. Webb, and within seconds she had gotten his room number and was in the elevator, heading towards his penthouse. To her surprise, the door was open, and immediately she entered. "Hello?" Purity called out, but there was no reply, and the lights were out. The place seemed as though it was an abandoned home. The light coming from the far end of the room of the penthouse was enough to alert Purity to her boss's location. Sprinting towards the room, she paused. At the foot of the bed, on the floor with an empty glass of rum in his hand, was her boss. His eyes were shut, and there was no sign of movement, and this sent Purity into panic mode. "Mr. Webb?" Purity beckoned. But still there was no movement, and without thinking she walked up to him, got down on her knees, and shook him. Her heart softened as soon as she heard Mr. Webb grumbling, and his eyes shot wide open. "I am a wreck," Mr. Webb joked in a low voice, and his mouth reeked of rum. "I'll be back. I'll get you a glass of water," Purity informed her boss, quickly running towards the kitchen. She grabbed a bottled water from the fridge and ran back to his room. "Here you go." Purity lifted her boss into a sitting position and helped him drink his water until he was done. "I think I need to get you into bed. That way you can get ready for work tomorrow. Okay?" Purity asked her boss, but he kept quiet, and a tear fell from his eyes. "Mr. Webb, are you okay?" Purity asked, her concern for her boss intensifying. "I am such a wreck. It seems like I have it all together, but I can't even help my father," Mr. Webb spoke out, and it broke Purity's heart knowing that he felt that way. Not many people were aware that his father was battling pancreatic cancer. Therefore, Scott was to take over the company completely. "I understand how you feel, Mr. Webb." Without warning, Purity stepped back as the bottle of rum was thrown against the wall. There was a loud smashing sound, and then shards of glass scattered everywhere. Still in a state of shock, Purity covered her mouth as to stop herself from screaming, but unfortunately for her, a shriek escaped from her mouth, alerting the boss of her presence once more. As Scott turned his face, he was met with a frightened Purity, who had her hand over her mouth. He was overcome with shame that in his effort to relieve himself of his frustration, he had scared his most trusted employee. Ashamed of himself, he got off the floor, on his knees, one hand holding onto his bed so as not to fall over. He faced Purity and looked into her eyes. "I am sorry. I don't know what came over me," Scott apologized, but even as Purity relaxed, he could still see that she was shaken by his actions. "It's okay, Mr. Webb. I understand you," Purity explained, but as she tried standing up from the floor, Scott pulled her back down, and she landed in his arms. His lips were a few centimeters away from her, and their eyes burned into each other. Purity tried to pull away, but her boss's grip around her waist was too strong. "Scott, Mr. Webb, you have to let me go," Purity argued, as she tried to get herself out of Mr. Webb's grip. "I like it much more when you call me by my name and not formalize it. It makes me feel old when you say Mr.," Scott joked, but not once did he take his eyes off Purity. Looking into her gleaming eyes, he could swear that he was seeing a wide range of emotions. Looking at her up close, Scott saw a beauty that he had not seen or cared to look for. "Mr. Scott, I think you need to stop," Purity pleaded with him, as she tried to wiggle her way out of his strong arms. "What if I don't want to? Then what would you do?" Scott smirked, as he challenged Purity. This feisty side of her was one that he had not seen in the 4 years that they had worked together. "Mr. Scott, you're drunk, and you don't know what you're doing," Purity tried explaining to her boss, with the hope that some parts of his brain would still make sense of the matter. "I might be a bit drunk, but can we stop this, Purity?" Scott gritted his teeth, looking into Purity's eyes as his own filled with tears. "Stop what?" she asked him, confused about her boss's actions, deep down knowing that people of Mr. Webb's class did not entertain people like herself. "Stop the pretending. I see the way you look at me, with lust in your eyes. You want me just as bad as I want you." His words shocked Purity so much that she stopped trying to get herself out of Mr. Webb's embrace and just stared at him. "Yes, Purity. All these years I have seen the way you look at me, and I feel the same way too. Perhaps all I needed was the alcohol to get it out of me," Scott confessed to her. For once he was not afraid to air his feelings out in the open, and it felt good. There was a lump of emotions stuck in Purity's throat, one that she was struggling to swallow. For years, she had admired her boss's looks from afar, but he had confessed to noticing her, and that made her shy. Without warning her, Scott's hand touched her lips and ran down the side of her face. The smoothness of his hands filled Purity with so much desire that she tipped her head back as her body weakened. "I am sure that you are an adult and you know what we are about to do. If you don't want it, just tell me, and I will let you go," Scott whispered to her, his voice husky. The man needed some release. "I want you, and only you," Purity heard herself consent. Her mind was not thinking, only her body was. And she did not mind. "These men are nothing but trouble, I tell you," Purity heard her mother's voice replay in her mind. For years, her mother had warned her of how evil men were, and she had been burned a few times in the past, some of those wounds still too fresh. Chapter 4. Job. 1 week later. Never had the office felt this empty before. It had been an entire week since Mr. Webb had come back to the office, and everyone wondered why. But deep down, Purity knew exactly why he had not shown up for work. The night between the both of them at his penthouse apartment was the best that she had ever had. To feel Mr. Scott's hands over every part of her, and the best was having him fill her until he released and finally dropping beside her. Their night was followed by 2 extra rounds of lovemaking, and Scott wrapping his arm around Purity the entire night. Luckily for her, things had not been awkward in the morning, seeing that Scott had left before Purity got up from bed, and left her breakfast. "If you keep staring at that desk, you might just burn a hole into it." Purity spun around, only to find that it was her friend, Amelia. Quickly, Purity put up a brave smile. There was no need for her to show her emotions for the world to see. "Hey! Hi! What are you doing here?" Purity asked her friend, who raised a questionable eyebrow at her and raised a few documents in the air to show Purity. "I am here to drop these here, since your boss refuses to show up for work the past week. He must be wasted after that charity function you attended," Amelia commented. Purity could feel her cheeks redden, so she turned her back to Amelia and pretended to arrange Mr. Webb's already arranged table. "You should stop thinking bad about him all the time. He's not that bad." Purity came to her employer's defense, but quickly shut her eyes, as she had been doing too much of that lately. "You are always defending that man. If it wasn't for the fact that he doesn't date women like us, I would have thought that you were sleeping with the guy," Amelia joked, but she had no idea that the particular joke had hit home. "Are you all right?" Amelia asked Purity, who quickly turned to face her and plastered a smile on her face. "Yes, I'm doing okay, and in fact—" Before she could finish her sentence, the door swung open, and when both women turned around, there he was, Mr. Scott in his cream-colored suit filled with self-confidence. Purity held herself back. She wanted to run up to him and hug him, but she stopped herself. He stood at the door, looking at both women, his face ice-cold with a lack of emotion. As if knowing, Amelia knew that it was her cue to leave the office. After greeting her boss, Amelia walked past him and exited the office, whilst Purity stood at the door, staring at him. "Get me my files on my desk, and—" "They already are on your desk," Purity interrupted him, but she quickly stopped herself as she saw the look in his eyes. Not once did he smile at her, and his glare burnt deep into her until she looked away from him. "Don't ever interrupt me when I am talking." Scott's voice broke through the already tense room. He walked around his table, pulled out his office chair, and began to look through his files. Without saying another word, Purity walked out of his office and into her own. Throwing herself onto her office chair and shutting her eyes, she replayed the incident in Mr. Webb's office and wondered what had just happened. Deciding that her boss was probably having a bad day, Purity shrugged it off as nothing and continued doing her work. "How can you be so stupid?" Scott slapped himself repeatedly as he walked up and down the length of his office. The way he had treated Purity was uncalled for, especially when all she had done was her job. For the past week, he had avoided the office, ashamed that he had been rendered so weak that he had broken his #1 rule: never sleep with his employees. But he knew that he couldn't stop himself. That night at his apartment, he had seen a different side of Purity, one that he had not paid attention to. It was not the clothes she wore, but just her natural beauty. Purity was not his type, and that was the exact reason why he had hired her all those years ago, because he figured that he would not be tempted to sleep with her. His actions were unlike him, especially after he had abandoned her in his room, ashamed at having to look at her in the face. His office door swung open. Thinking that it was Purity and that he needed to apologize to her, Scott turned around. "You?" Scott asked, because standing in his doorway was none other than Rosette, his ex-girlfriend. "You don't look too happy to see me," Rosette taunted Scott, knowing quite well that she was not allowed in his building for the scene she had made a few months prior. Rosette shut the door behind her and proceeded to walk towards Scott. "Stop right there. How did you even get here when security knows that you are banned from this building?" Scott asked her, and she simply smiled. "I have my ways, but enough about that. I missed you, your body, and the way you make love to me," Rosette confessed, and this only made Scott roll his eyes in irritation. "I think you need to leave." "Why are you chasing me away? Don't tell me that it's because of that secretary of yours." Her words rung in Scott's ears so loud that it almost deafened him. "What? I don't understand what it is that you're saying," Scott asked. Rosette simply smiled and played with her hair. "I don't know. I simply think that you don't want me because you're sleeping with her." "Calm down, Scott. Don't let her play you," Scott thought to himself. The last thing he wanted was for Rosette to sell the story on a tabloid and ruin Purity's reputation. "Are you crazy? You think that I would ever date a woman like Purity? I mean, look at her. She's not even attractive." Scott raised his voice, his words making his mouth sour as he spat them out. "Well, because I thought—" "Don't you dare think anything. Purity is not my type of woman. I would rather sleep with a dead dog than with an ill-fit woman like her," Scott spat out, pausing and realizing what he had just said was utterly untrue and vile. But the smirk on Rosette's face was enough for Scott to know that is just what she had wanted from him. 6 years later. Purity looked up at the shiny skyscraper, and its length was truly astounding. Not to mention, it hurt her to look up at it. "You have one chance. If you screw this up, oh well, you're through," Purity told herself, as she took in a deep breath and entered into one of the most expensive buildings in Canary Wharf. The atmosphere was not what Purity had expected. The interior of the building was far grander than she had thought, and everyone wore suits. And even as she walked past most of them, she could smell their expensive scented fragrances filling the space. "Excuse me, how may I help you?" Purity quickly turned her head, only to meet face to face with an older man. His green eyes pierced into Purity's own eyes, but his smile was enough reassurance to know that he was kind. She remembered a time when she had to smile with everyone she met. The only difference was that her smile was genuine, and she had loved her job. She quickly removed the memory from her face. There was no use remembering the happier days, because it would only make her sad. She raised her hand to shake the man's before her, not forgetting to show her pearly whites. "My name is PurityEvans, and I'm a candidate for the position of PA to the finance exec." The man paused, looked at her from head to toe, and smiled. "My name is Pascal. The interview is on the 10th floor." His voice, cool and collected. Before she could ask anything more, the man moved away from her to attend to people who were obviously at a higher class than she was. Over the past 6 years, she had learned to grow a thick skin. People are who they are, and she was who she was, and that was final. Even as she walked into the elevator, it was fancy. All those buttons lit up as the elevator door slammed shut, and she pressed the up button to the 10th floor. As the elevator traveled towards the 10th floor, Purity tucked her hair behind her ear and lowered her skirt. She was lucky that she had a friend like Barnard, who borrowed his late sister's skirt suit. Even as she thought about it, it was weird that she was borrowing clothes from a deceased person. The bell rang, and the elevator door swung open, only to reveal a glass interior and black marbled floor. As she stepped out, the space felt cold and looked formal, probably because of everyone that was either dressed too formally or wasn't smiling as they walked past each other. "Are you the new applicant?" someone asked her, and as Purity turned around, she faced a short woman with red hair. She too looked unhappy. "Good morning. Yes, I am the applicant," Purity answered, feeling embarrassed that she could not answer a simple question without stuttering. To her surprise, the shorter woman smiled at her. "Don't worry, dear. Everyone gets nervous on their first day. My name is Bertha, and I make coffee for these rich snobs," Bertha joked, and Purity smiled. Finally, someone with a sense of humor. "My name is Purity Evans." "Well, nice to meet you, Mrs. It's Miss Purity. I'm not married." "It's okay, my dear. You're still young," Bertha joked. "By the way, I know that you were supposed to be doing an interview, but there's no time for that. Mr. David is in a meeting. Go in there and just take notes for him, okay?" "Okay," Purity responded. "Down the hall, first door to your left," Bertha explained, and Purity did just that. Deciding to go against the doctor's orders, Scott had made it a point to come to work, even though his cold had weakened him. His body was weak, his eyes red and his voice hoarse, but that was not enough to keep him from coming into the office and presenting the fine work he had done. "As you can all see, profit has tripled, and we are hoping that this next collection will be better than the last." Scott presented his findings as the projector reflected the charts onto the whiteboard. Even as the discussion continued behind him, he only had eyes for his achievement. The conversation behind him continued, but if there was one sound that annoyed him most, it was the sound of the door sliding open, a sign that someone was late. Irritation quickly clouded him as he played with his temple as though he was preparing himself for his outburst. Scott slowly turned around to see who it was that had dared to arrive late during his meeting, and as soon as he saw the culprit, his heart stopped. He paused, his heart beating 1,000 times faster and so loud he could hear it in his ears. She was fixing herself in the chair on the far end corner of the conference room, and when she looked up, their eyes met, and it seemed as though the world around them had evaporated, leaving only the both of them. Even as Purity sat far away from him, he could still see her brown eyes, her pupils widening as she too must not have expected to see him. 6 years. That was when he had last seen her. One day he had ignored her after a blissful night of lovemaking, and the next day, she was gone. Now here she was, 6 years later at his new building, in his conference room. "Mr. Webb, are you okay?" someone asked him. Without looking at the person, Scott smiled, not once looking away from Purity. "I am quite fine, actually. This meeting is adjourned," Scott ordered, and anyone with a brain knew that it was fruitless to argue with him. Therefore, they all packed up and began to leave. Chapter 5. Old Friends. Purity began packing her belongings along with the rest of the board members. She would leave this place and never return. Seeing Scott had brought up so many memories, and she didn't want to relive them ever again. "Miss Evans, please, stay." Scott's voice echoed through the room. Or was it just her imagination that amplified his voice so much that it put fear into her and froze her on the spot? Even though Scott had asked her so politely, Purity could hear that demanding undertone that he always had. Scott had waited for the entire room to clear up, and as soon as the last member left, he was ready to take his pound of flesh. "What are you doing here?" Scott asked, her back still facing him. And just as she picked up her notebook, she bolted for the door. But Scott had gotten there before her and blocked her exit. Purity knew that no matter how much she had wanted to push Scott away, it would not work. Scott was a foot taller than she was, more masculine and broad-shouldered, putting her at a huge disadvantage. She held her bag to her chest, as if she was trying to widen the space between her chest and that of Scott's own, but she could still feel his presence. "Can I, please, just leave?" Purity asked Scott, her tone of voice low as she chose to look away from him, rather than talk to him directly. "When you speak to me, you look at me. Now I ask again, what are you doing here?" Scott asked her, his voice aggressive, as though Purity was the last person in the world he would have preferred seeing. Purity thought of not answering. After all, she owed nothing to him. That was until he began tapping his feet on the carpeted floor of the conference room. Although the last time Purity had set her eyes on Scott was 6 years ago, she almost smiled. Old habits were hard to rid oneself of, because Scott tapped his foot on the ground whenever he was reaching his breaking point. "Well then, I guess we'll have to do this the hard way," Scott muttered, before grabbing Purity by her arm and dragging her out of the conference room. "Let me go!" Purity yelled as she tried freeing herself from Scott's grip, but there was no use. He was stronger than she was, and she simply could not compare to him. Scott pulled her along the hallway as everyone stared at the both of them. "Security!" Scott called out, and it was then that Purity realized what was going on. Scott was going to throw her out of the building like a common thief. As he dragged her towards the elevator, Purity could not help but feel embarrassed as countless employees stood frozen on the spot and stared at her. "Let me go! I'm not a thief!" Purity begged and struggled until Scott stopped. 2 large men in suits stopped in front of them, and they did not look friendly. "Yes, Mr. Webb," both men said in unison, ready to take their boss's order and carry it out swiftly. Purity watched in disbelief. Over the years that she had worked for Scott, she had seen people dragged out of the building, but never had she thought that she would be the one to be ejected. "I want you to throw this lady here out of the building. She is trespassing on private property. Got it?" Scott ordered both men. Purity watched in disbelief as one of the security guards took her from Scott, and they began walking her towards the elevator. Scott watched as both his security personnel walked Purity towards the elevator. Seeing Purity was the last thing that Scott would have imagined. He remembered quite vividly how she had left without a word. She had simply vanished. For months, he had struggled to wrap his head around the work, and it was only then that Scott realized how much he depended on Purity. He had blamed himself for their affair when she too was as guilty as he was. "Stop, sir! Stop!" Scott turned around, and it was Bertha calling out to him, until she reached him, out of breath. "What?" Scott asked Bertha, irritated that she was disrupting possibly the best revenge he'd ever had. "You cannot kick her out," she informed Scott. He raised his eyebrows at Bertha. Scott could not understand why she would be defending a stranger like Purity. "Why not?" "Because she's here to apply for the PA position for Mr. David," Bertha spat out, and Scott froze on the spot. Hearing Bertha's words seemed to have stopped time. "Stop," he ordered his security personnel, and they did just that. Even from the distance, both Scott and Purity looked into each other's eyes. So many unsaid words were said through their eyes locking. "Follow me to my office," Scott ordered Purity. Still shaken by the recent event, she shrugged herself out of the security personnel's grip. Scott faced Bertha, lowering his mouth to her. "Tell David he should find himself another PA," Scott whispered into her ear, and poor Bertha's eyes widened in fear. "But, Mr. Webb, that's impossible. She was meant for Mr. David, but I mistakenly sent her into your conference." Bertha stopped herself. The look Scott gave her indicated that in no way was he interested in what she had to say. "Okay, sir, I will do just that." Bertha obeyed without arguing any further. The last thing she wanted was to go against Scott, who had the power to fire her on the spot. "Follow me to my office," Scott ordered Purity, before walking away from her. Clutching her bag close to her chest, she ran after Scott, seeing that he took such big steps with no regard that Purity's feet were not as long as his. Scott had always been a man that was sure of himself and knew what he wanted, but Purity's presence had sent him into turmoil. He was lost, and he was not afraid to admit it. The anger that washed over him as he set his eyes on Purity was one that he could not contain, but he still felt the tug of his heart as his security personnel walked her away. Even as she walked behind him, Scott did not know what he was about to do or say to her. Her presence was one that Scott could feel. She still had that power over him after 6 years of being apart. Unlocking his office door, Scott walked in, turned to his side of the desk, and sat down on his Italian leather office chair. He watched as Purity walked in, shut the door behind her, and her attention quickly diverted as she studied his office. Scott watched as Purity's eyes trailed over his book collection, among other artifacts. He inwardly smiled as he remembered that Purity was always one to pay attention to details. That little bit of happiness only lasted a second before it was replaced with anger and pain. "Stop looking at my things like that. Otherwise you might burn a hole in them?" Scott's pupils widened as Purity finished his sentence for him. She quickly looked away, embarrassed that she had shown how much she truly knew him. "Sit down." Scott pointed at the visitor seat in front of him. Without hesitation, Purity walked towards it and sat down. Her handbag was still clutched close to her chest as she looked at the glass window behind Scott. "Like my new office? It's bigger than the one I used to have," Scott bragged, showing her just how rich he had become over the last 6 years that she had left him. Purity looked at Scott and smiled. "It looks good. More modern. I remembered how you used to hate your previous office because everything felt so old and—" Purity paused at the sight of Scott's twitching eye. He was irritated that she was reminding him of the past. "I hope you are not trying to get into my good books." Scott's warning was clear as day, a sign to Purity that she should not dare to push his buttons any further. Purity remembered the days when she would follow Scott like some lovesick puppy, and now she knew that she had to stand up for herself. "Look, if you're upset about what happened 6 years ago, then I suggest that you forget it, just like I did, okay?" Purity blurted out. Scott seemed unmoved by what she had said. He simply stared at her with no emotion on his face. "Firstly, I am not upset about what happened 6 years ago. Annoyed, maybe. You did leave a lot of work undone, which I had to take over from you," Scott said plainly. Purity felt a sting in her heart, knowing that Scott had not missed her hurt a bit, proving that once again she meant nothing to him. "Oh." That was all Purity managed to say. There was nothing more to say to someone who had no emotions, such as Scott. "Enough of all this talking. Be at work at 8 in the morning, and I do not take lightly to late coming," Scott ordered Purity, before spinning in his office chair and facing the view of the other buildings in Canary Wharf. "But I was supposed to work with Mr. David, if I am correct," Purity argued, but Scott simply rolled his eyes, a small part of him missing the old Purity, the one that never argued and simply did what she was told. Scott spun his office chair around, his cold stare aimed at Purity. "Let me make things clear for you. I am the majority shareholder, and what I say goes. And if you do not agree, you may leave this building and never set foot in here again." Purity swallowed the lump in her throat. She knew that Scott was serious, and she was not one to call his bluff. "Okay," Purity answered. She knew that there was no use arguing, because she needed this job. After leaving the UK 6 years ago, she had chosen to move to South Africa, but now she was back, without a penny to her name. "Good. See you tomorrow at 8, Scott informed her, and again spun his chair around to face the city. Purity stood from her chair and walked out of his office. As soon as she shut the door behind her, she let out a breath, one that she had not realized she had been holding. Every step she took towards the elevator, Purity felt like running away and never coming back again. She knew the kind of man Scott was, and he never missed an opportunity to get his revenge on those that wronged him. Now here she was, in his line of fire. Moments later, there was a knock on his door, and he knew just who it was that would dare to knock on his door after the scene he had created with Purity a while ago. "Come in," Scott called out. Bertha peeked her head through his door. "Here it is?" Bertha raised the file in the air and quickly walked toward Scott's table and handed it to him. "Thank you, Bertha. You may leave," Scott instructed her, and she did just as she was told. Scott looked through Purity's resume. Surprisingly, she was still unmarried, as well as worked in South Africa. "So, that's where you've been all along," Scott thought to himself. The private investigator that he hired 6 years ago had found no traces of Purity in the city, and Scott had simply given up the search. Scott put down the file and smiled at himself. He had a huge score to settle with Purity, and luckily for him, she was delivered to him on a silver platter. Chapter 6. Day 1. Purity unlocked the door to her apartment, the one that she shared with her friend Barnard. Kicking her shoes off and allowing them to hit the ground was by far the best thing that had happened to her the entire morning. All she had wanted when she returned to London was to get a job. She got what she wanted, but not the way that she planned it. 6 years ago, she had run away from the very person she was now employed by. Purity covered her face with her hands, trying to make out how her life had turned into a nightmare within a matter of hours. She had a secret to keep, and she would keep it for as long as she could. Finally deciding that there was no use crying over spilled milk, Purity walked inside her small kitchen, made herself a hot cup of tea, and drank. Even as she walked into the living room of her and her friend's tiny apartment, she strolled, trying to rid herself of thinking of Scott. He had changed in the past 6 years. The man she saw in the office was different, more cold and unfeeling. The door shot wide open, and before Purity could turn around to see who it was, the tiny voice calling to her warmed her heart. "Mommy! Mommy!" Purity smiled as her daughter, Violet, wrapped her tiny hands around her waist. No matter how much of a bad day she had, her daughter always made her see the brighter side of things. Purity wrapped her arms around her little girl, and a tear almost fell from her eye. But she knew that she could not cry before her daughter. Violet looked at her mother, her hazel eyes glistening as they met her mother's own eyes. Within seconds, Barnard walked into the apartment, looking out of breath. "As sweet as she is, I am quickly reminded of why it is that I do not have any kids," Barnard confessed, and this only made Purity smile. For the past month that she had been living with Barnard, he had shown Violet the love of a father that she had never had, and for that brief moment, Purity felt bad for depriving her little girl of the chance to have a father. "Are you okay?" Barnard asked her, and she quickly put on a fake smile. "Yes, I'm okay." Purity smiled, but her smile was not enough to convince Barnard. "Violet, can you go to Mommy's room? Uncle needs to speak to Mommy," Barnard asked Violet in his little voice as he tried to get down to Violet's level. "Okay, Uncle Bar," Violet responded. Purity smiled. She watched her daughter walk away towards her room. Purity had always known that her daughter was an outgoing child, but she was surprised at how quickly Violet had taken a liking to Barnard and named him Bar. "Now, are you ready to talk or do I have to wrangle it out of you?" Barnard asked Purity in his no-nonsense tone of voice, and she knew that it was best that she spilled the beans before Barnard made inquiries. Purity sipped her tea, preparing herself for what she was about to say. "I got the job," Purity informed Barnard, who clapped his hands together in excitement, but it was short-lived as his smile faded. "You got the job after searching for one for weeks, and now you don't even look excited about it," Barnard stated. "How can I be excited when I'm back where I started?" Purity lashed out, quickly looking behind her to make sure that her daughter was nowhere in sight. "I don't understand what you mean." "I got the job, but my boss, he's Scott Webb," Purity confessed. She did not need to explain any further, because the sheer look of shock on Barnard's face was enough for her to know that he understood what she was saying. "Scott Webb? Violet's father?" Barnard whispered, when in essence he already knew the answer to his question. "Yes? Who else?" Purity asked her friend. "What are you going to do about it?" Barnard asked her the million-dollar question, the one that Purity herself had no clear answer to. She looked up at her friend, worry evident in her eyes. "For now, nothing." "I am not going to tell him about Violet," Purity told her friend, who was not one bit surprised by her decision. "What's the reason for you not telling him about his daughter?" Barnard asked her. For as long as he had known Purity, she had never revealed the reason why she had simply run away without telling Scott about her pregnancy. "Scott has the power to take Violet away from me. She is all that I have, and I will not allow him to take her from me," Purity confessed. Deep down, she hid her true reasons for her big secret. "I will not force you to do something that you are not comfortable with, but as your friend, I have to tell you this. Think about what it is that you are doing. It's affecting Violet negatively," Barnard told Purity, and she knew just how right Barnard was, but she refused to admit it. "I have to get Violet ready. We will talk later." Purity avoided the discussion further, and she walked towards her room to tend to her daughter. Scott stared at the wristwatch on his arm, and it was confirmed. Purity was 10 minutes late for work, and he could not figure out why that had happened. For the 4 years that Purity had worked for him, he could not remember a time where she was ever late. Rather, it was always him that was late after a long night of partying. Scott paced his office, worried that Purity might have once again run away from him. But this time he vowed that he would not leave a single stone unturned until he found her. The more he spoke to himself, the angrier he got that Purity still had this much control over him. "You look worried." Scott turned his attention to his office door, and there David was, smiling at him. There were days where Scott felt like slapping the smirk off David's face, but every time he tried, he was reminded that they were in an office space with people who respected him. "What are you doing in my office?" Scott asked angrily as he walked towards David. The two men faced each other. "Well, I simply came to visit you, and the PA that you took from me." David teased Scott, who balled his hands in a fist beside himself. He knew he had to stay calm, otherwise there would be a fight inside his office. "I did not take your PA from you. She walked into my conference meeting, and I realized that I needed a PA," Scott informed David, not smiling as he delivered his message. David stared at Scott, trying to figure him out, but he couldn't. Scott was not the type to show his emotions, and standing in front of him, that was evident enough. "What is it about this girl that made you hire her?" "I don't understand what you are getting at," Scott asked, suspicious as to why it was that David was asking him all these questions. "I just find it strange that for a brief period you fired every PA that you hired over the past few years. Then you stopped working with a PA. And then this girl comes in and you hire her." David questioned Scott, an action that Scott was not finding funny, and neither was he going to entertain such actions from a man that he considered lower than him. With his eyes twitching from frustration, just about to take action, Scott's door swung open, and before both men, Purity walked into the office. "Good morning. My apologies, I really—" Before Purity could finish her sentence, David interrupted her. With a huge smile on David's face, unlike Scott, who seemed mad at her. "No need to apologize, my dear. None of us are perfect. Hi, my name is David, and you must be—" "PurityEvans, and I'm the new—" "PA, yes, I know that. In fact, you were supposed to be my PA, but it's best I don't say before I upset someone," David told Purity. Right then she smiled, embarrassed that they were speaking about Scott in his presence. Scott could not control the anger inside of him as he watched both David and Purity hit it off, whilst he stood like a stranger in his own office. The smile on Purity's face was one that Scott had not seen in 6 years. Yet David had managed to achieve that in a matter of seconds from meeting Purity. "I do not mean to disturb your conversation, but I think we have some work to do." Scott disturbed their conversation, looking irritably whilst doing so. David threw his hands in the air, flashing a smile at Scott, knowing deep down that he was getting to Scott. "Come on, Scott. You know all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," David said, as he smiled at Scott, clearly egging him on. Choosing not to smile, rather, Scott remained neutral at this point. "Leave my office now." Scott raised his voice at David so loud that Purity stepped back. He scared her. The fear in her eyes was enough to make Scott feel ashamed of his action. David smiled one last time and turned to face Purity. "My apologies for my business partner's behavior. If you need anything, please, feel free to call me," David informed Purity, his words making her smile, before he walked away and exited the office. Not knowing where his anger had come from, Scott paced his office, running his fingers through his hair as Purity stood on the same spot. "What is wrong with you?" Purity asked him. She raised her voice, coming as a shock to Scott, who could not remember a day that Purity had ever raised her voice at anyone. "What?" Scott asked her, still amazed that the little shy Purity that he once knew could raise her voice at him. "I said, what is wrong with you? I admit that I'm late, but that did not mean that you should be mad at Mr. David. The poor man was just trying to be nice. Maybe he could give you a few pointers on being nice to people." Purity sternly spoke to Scott. She had no fear in her eyes, and not once was she afraid to take Scott on. "I see you have grown wings. Get back to work before I clip them off." Scott's warning was clear, and even as Purity read into his facial gesture, she knew that he had no problem getting rid of her. She watched Scott walk around to his side of the desk and sat down on his big, black leather office chair, his aura oozing confidence so much that it filled their office space. "Take a seat." Scott pointed towards the empty seat opposite to his own, the smile on his face showing Purity just how much power Scott knew he had. Without hesitating, Purity walked towards the chair and sat down. "Get ready, because we have a lot of work to do. I hope you still know how to do your job properly," Scott questioned her, his voice low but his eyes burning into hers, as though he was trying to provoke her. She had known Scott for quite some time. She was well aware of his tricks and how he manipulated situations to his advantage. Purity smiled. Shock appeared on his face, but he quickly hid it. "Too late there, Scott. I have seen all that I needed to see," Purity thought to herself as she smiled inwardly. "Of course I know how to do my job properly. Not once did you complain about my work, in the office and out of the office," Purity replied, her reply setting off a nerve on Scott's side. Chapter 7. New Life. 3 days later. 6 years ago, working for Scott was never something that Purity considered difficult, and his disorganized way of doing things had never bothered her, until now. As much as she had wanted to quit the job because of Scott's unrealistic demands, Purity knew that she needed this job. After all, Violet was depending on her, dearly. Standing in the copy room, Purity leaned against the copy machine. Her legs were about to give in, and her heels were not helping matters at all. Shutting her eyes for just a second, she hoped it would help her relax, right before Scott ordered her to run some more errands for him. "You lasted this long? You must be a keeper." Purity's eyes shot wide open, and she quickly stood up straight. To her surprise, it was none other than Bertha, leaning at the frame of the door. "Oh, Bertha! Sorry, I didn't know that you were standing there." Purity quickly apologized, turning away from Bertha and realizing that all her copies were done. "You are one special woman. Do you know that?" Bertha told Purity. Upon hearing Bertha say those words, Purity spun around to face the older woman. I beg your pardon? Purity asked her, to whom Bertha responded with a smile on her face. She walked closer towards Purity, looking at her in the eyes as though she was studying her. I knew you were special from the first time you stepped into this building. Just something about you, that's all, Bertha told her, and her smile grew. I still don't understand what you're trying to say to me, Purity asked, still confused as to what message Bertha was trying to portray. You have managed to do what others could not. You have stuck around, unlike his other PAs who have not stuck around, Bertha casually informed Purity, raising her eyebrow, a sign of applaud. Oh, I was not aware of that. To be honest, I don't know whether I should be happy or not, Purity told Bertha. She then turned around and retrieved her copies from the copy machine, but before she left, Bertha stopped her. You're doing a great job. Just don't get distracted. Not all these men are as good as they appear to be. Purity smiled as she walked past Bertha, but the entire time she walked towards her boss's office, she could not help but be bothered over what Bertha had said to her. Purity did not need such warnings, because 6 years ago she had fallen into the hands of the same man that she now worked for. Are you okay? She was seemingly startled by the young woman that approached her, and it was only then that Purity realized that she was standing in the middle of the office hallway, simply gazing into nowhere. Yes, I'm okay. I just had a lot on my mind, Purity explained, her reply seemingly enough for the young woman, and she simply walked away. Even as Purity stood before Scott's office, she clutched the pile of copies close to her chest and exhaled the breath that she was holding in. Everything is going to be all right. Just breathe in, Purity assured herself. As she unlocked the door to Scott's office, her heart stopped. Seated on Scott's lap, behind his desk, was none other than Rosette. Purity caught the pile of papers before it fell to the ground. The most shock she had ever felt was when she sat down on her toilet 6 years ago and found out that she was pregnant. But other than that, it was this moment. Rosette slowly stood up from Scott's lap, her eyes burning into Purity's own with a smile on her face, almost taunting Purity. Hi, long time no see, Rosette greeted her as she walked around Scott's table and made her way towards Purity, and stood right in front of her. So, you won't welcome me? Rosette asked her. Using all her restraint, Purity smiled at Rosette, a smile that was hard for her to pull off. Good day, Rosette. Indeed, it has been a long time since the two of us have crossed paths, Purity told her. She could see behind Rosette as Scott fixed himself up. There was no need for Purity to ask what had happened here between the both of them. It was all evident. Anyway, I have to leave the both of you to finish with your work, Rosette informed Purity, making sure she mouthed each word carefully. She turned away from Purity as she turned her attention towards Scott, who had somewhat fixed himself. Oh, and Scott? Call me when you're not so busy, Rosette told Scott. She turned her attention back to Purity, smiled one last time, and walked past her, her heels clicking along the way. The door shut behind her. There was a sudden silence in the room, one that even made Scott feel unaffordable. I can explain. There's no need to explain anything, Mr. Webb. You are the boss, therefore you can do whatever it is that you want in here, Purity explained, her explanation easing the creases on Scott's forehead. Upon placing the paper copies onto Scott's table, she turned and looked at him and pointed at his collar. You've got lipstick on your collar. Might want to get it cleaned before the rest of your employees start to notice, Purity warned Scott, who quickly pulled his collar to inspect the damage done. As soon as Scott saw the red lipstick on his collar, he tried to hide it away, feeling embarrassed at the scene that had taken place not long ago. Before Scott could explain things further, Purity was already at the exit, and by the time he tried to call her back, Purity had walked out already. Even with her job on the line, Purity knew that she had to step out of work and make her way to her daughter's school. The school had called her and informed her that Violet was feeling unwell. Without informing Scott, Purity rushed out of the office as she made her way to her daughter's school, with her heart pumping inside her chest the entire time. The thought of something bad happening to her little girl scared her, and with that, moving to a new country, it made matters all the worse for her. After fetching little Violet from school, Purity could not help but look back at her little girl and smile, hoping that it would cheer her little girl up. Carrying her daughter in her arms as they boarded the train to her workplace, another thought entered her mind. She contemplated how she would keep Violet away from prying eyes, because children were not allowed in the workplace.
"Where is she?"
Scott scolded 2 other female staff standing in his office, and neither of them answered. Rather, they both looked at the carpet beneath them to avoid looking into Scott's furious eyes. He was beyond upset with Purity. For the past 3 hours he had been looking for her, and she was nowhere to be found. This sent Scott off the edge. Never had he given any of his employees as many chances as he had given Purity, and it was beginning to show.
"Get out of my office now!"
Scott yelled at both women, and by the time he looked up at them, they had left his office, and that was for the best. By the time he turned his attention towards his door, there she was. Purity stood at the entrance of his office, eyes wide open and mouth trembling.
"Since you have made a habit of exiting this office without permission, you might as well enter my office without permission,"
Scott taunted Purity. She walked into Scott's office, nearly dragging her feet as she walked towards him. "I can explain," Purity uttered, but the irritated look on Scott's face was enough to scare her into silence.
"Then explain to me why you were out of the office for more than 3 hours when I needed you to get done with my work,"
Scott yelled, his voice echoing throughout the entire office. "Don't tell him about Violet, or he might find out the truth," Purity warned herself mentally, because she knew just how much damage this would cause. "Well,
she was with me."
A deep voice spoke up from behind Purity that left even her shocked. Immediately, she turned around, and there Mr. David was, staring at her with a smile on his face.
"What?"
Scott asked Mr. David, because he was as surprised as Purity was, although deep down she was thankful for what Mr. David was doing for her. She could not understand why it was that he was helping her. Mr. David turned his attention away from Purity, placed his hands into his pockets, and walked toward Scott's front desk.
"It was entirely my fault. I needed something done downtown, so I figured, since you stole my secretary from me, perhaps I could borrow her for one favor,"
Mr. David explained, but his explanation did nothing to relax Scott's anger at that very moment. Rather, it only made him madder.
"How dare you take my assistant without informing me beforehand?"
Scott raised his voice even louder than it was before.
"Scott, I think you should lower your voice. Your door is open, and many of your employees are walking past that door. You wouldn't want them to see you like this, would you? I mean, the top boss acting like an animal."
Mr. David taunted Scott, and for a split second it appeared as though sense had come back to him.
"David, I think it is best if you leave my office now,"
Scott told Mr. David, his voice lowered but still concealing all the anger behind the calmness.
"Okay, I will, but please, don't take your anger out on Purity. She was only obeying my instruction,"
Mr. David begged Scott before he exited the office. Now that Mr. David had left the office, there was only Purity and Scott, looking at each other dead on. Never before had Purity been afraid of Scott as she was now, because the man before her was a complete monster.
"This better be the last time that you disappear when I need you. I left the files for the new designs on your desk. I want them done and no questions asked. Understand?"
Scott warned her. Without saying another word, Purity nodded her head in agreement and exited Scott's office. As she walked towards her office, Purity could not help but feel a sense of calm enter her body the further she walked away. Purity entered her office, and as soon as she shut the door and turned around, she jumped in fear. Right before her, sitting on the table, was Mr. David. Her heart stopped. Her eyes traveled around, looking for Violet, and she was nowhere to be found. This sent her blood pressure shooting for the roof.
"Hi, Purity. What is the matter? You seem as though you've seen a ghost,"
Mr. David asked her. Even though she was worried, Purity knew that it was best that she not say a word to Mr. David. The rules of the office clearly stated that children were not allowed in the office, yet she had no choice but to bring her daughter into the office and hide her. "Oh, you see, thank you for helping me get Mr. Scott, out of my hair." Purity thanked him. Meanwhile, her eyes scaled her office space, looking for her daughter, but she still could not find her.
"You're welcome. Scott tends to be a pain in the... You know what I mean. By the way, why are you so nervous? It seems as though you are looking for something? Or someone?"
Mr. David asked Purity, and those words sent a ring inside of her ears, as she did not know how to answer his question.